That incredibly specific, quiet confidence that kind of settles in your chest when you feel like you have finally figured the game out.
Oh, absolutely, when everything is just clicking into place.
Right. Think about where you are right now. You've put in the hours, you've played by all the unwritten rules of your industry, and you've secured that promising trajectory. You feel perfectly, completely in control of your career path.
You look at your 5-year plan, and it just makes
The
sense.
math is mathing. You are contributing, you are valued, and your identity is securely tethered to your professional output.
Which is a great feeling while it lasts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, out of absolutely nowhere, the floor just falls out from under you.
Yeah, and it is the suddenness that does the profound psychological damage. We aren't talking about a slow, recognizable leak in a tire here.
Yeah, you don't have time to pull over.
Right. We were talking about a catastrophic, instantaneous structural failure of the reality you were building.
You wake up on a Tuesday, you log into your laptop and your access badge doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or you walk into a sudden all-hands Zoom meeting and your entire division is just erased.
Just gone in a matter of minutes.
Or a business partner, someone you've shared holidays with, legally locks you out of the company you built together in your own garage.
It happens so much more often than people want to admit.
It really does. So today, we are taking a deep dive into a fascinating document titled A Life Lesson from Monte Cristo.
It is such a brilliant, unexpected text.
It really is. It extracts these incredibly profound philosophical and psychological takeaways from the classic story of Edmond Dantes. Our mission today is to take these centuries-old lessons of betrayal, absolute imprisonment, and eventual redemption and apply them directly to our focus.
Right, applying them to surviving, navigating, and actually overcoming modern professional setbacks.
Exactly, because this story serves as such a perfect mirror. So, setting the stage, who is Edmond Dantes before everything goes wrong?
Well, if we look at the core premise of Alexandre Dumas's character, we see a perfect reflection of the modern professional you just described. Here is a young, exceptionally happy man.
Just a normal guy, right?
Completely. He isn't royalty, he isn't wildly powerful or politically connected, but he is highly competent. He has a promising career as a sailor, he's on the verge of being made captain of his ship based purely on his merit, and he has a loving fiancée.
His future is completely mapped out and certain.
Certain in his mind, yes. And most importantly, Edmund quietly believes the ultimate, deeply ingrained human myth.
Ooh, what's the myth?
The belief that doing the right thing guarantees a just reward.
Oh, wow. The myth of the meritocracy.
Exactly.
Let's really pull that apart, because if you are listening to this deep dive, you have almost certainly bought into that myth at some point in your life. We are conditioned from childhood to believe in the just world fallacy.
Right, the idea that the universe is inherently fair.
Yes. The idea is, if I put my head down, if I produce excellent work, if I don't participate in toxic office politics, the universe, or at least my executive board, will recognize my inherent value and reward me accordingly.
It's a comforting thought. But the source text we are diving into pulls absolutely no punches here. It shatters that illusion immediately.
Just breaks it right over its knee.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It introduces this concept about the sheer fragility of our control. Because, as the text points out, the world does not operate on fairness. Edmund, entirely through the jealousy and targeted betrayal of people he thought were his peers, loses everything.
And he doesn't lose it gradually over time?
No, it's instantaneous. He is thrown into the Chateau d'Is, which is a cold stone fortress, a literal, inescapable dungeon.
Yeah, and there is no trial. There is no HR offboarding process. There is no explanation whatsoever.
None. And the document isolates the variables of his downfall in a way that is highly relevant to modern career dynamics. It explicitly points out that Edmund was not bad at his job.
Right, he didn't mess up.
He didn't make a massive ethical breach. He didn't mismanage company funds. The text emphasizes that no matter how meticulously you plan your life, no matter how flawless your performance reviews are, there are massive forces entirely outside your sphere of control.
Forces like the envy of a colleague who feels threatened by your competence.
Exactly. Or bureaucratic negligence. Or just pure, chaotic, macroeconomic chance.
The algorithm just decides you're redundant.
Right. The illusion of control is biologically comforting to us. It reduces our baseline anxiety. But the test argues that it's ultimately a fragile construct.
I look at Edmund's cold stone fortress in this text, and it feels less like a historical, physical place and much more like a potent metaphor for the modern career catastrophe.
Oh, the psychological isolation is identical.
Completely. You might not be chained to a stone wall, but think about a sudden mass layoff. You weren't let go because of your performance. Your name was simply a cell on a spreadsheet.
A cell that needed to be deleted to satisfy a quarterly earnings report.
Yeah. Or consider the entrepreneur who gets ousted by their own board of directors, locked out of the very vision they birthed. Or a researcher who watches a rival take credit for years of diligent, unglamorous work.
The rival gets the funding and the promotion, and the original creator is entirely sidelined.
And the immediate aftermath of those events is where the human brain just short circuits.
It really does. Look at Edmund's initial reaction in the text. He spends years in the absolute dark, essentially agonizing over three questions.
Which are?
Why me? Who did this? How can this possibly happen?
Which mirrors exactly what happens to professionals today. That obsessive, paralyzing phase of career grief.
This is a very recognizable pattern.
If you've been unexpectedly let go, or if you know someone who has, you know exactly what this looks like. He spent weeks, sometimes months, frantically scrolling back through your memory.
Looking for clues that probably don't exist.
Exactly. You scour over past emails looking for hidden subtext. You replay incredibly mundane Zoom meetings in your head.
Analyzing the tone of your manager's voice from a Tuesday 3 months ago.
Desperately trying to find the exact moment the timeline fractured. You were just trying to find the why.
And there is a biological mechanism behind that. The human brain is a prediction engine. It relies on narrative consistency to feel safe.
So when something random happens, it panics.
Exactly. When a sudden betrayal or layoff occurs, that narrative consistency is violently ruptured. The brain believes that if it can just find the why, if it can identify the specific mistake or the specific enemy, it can regain control of the environment.
Like if I figure out what I did wrong, I can fix it.
Right. It's a survival mechanism. But the text asserts something radical here. It says that obsessing over the why actually traps you in the dungeon.
Because you can't change it.
Precisely. Avoiding hardship is mathematically impossible over the arc of a long career. What actually dictates your future is not the event itself, but the nature of your response when the narrative falls apart.
So accepting that you have fundamentally lost control is actually the first step.
Paradoxically, yes. It is the required first step to regaining your agency. You cannot rebuild until you mourn the illusion that you were ever fully in control to begin with.
I think about it like playing a deeply immersive video game where you are having the absolute best run of your life.
Okay, I like this analogy.
You've memorized the map, you're beating all your high scores, you're entirely in the zone, and then someone walks through the living room and trips over the power cord.
And the screen just goes instantly black.
Exactly. In that moment, you have a choice. You can spend the next 6 hours yelling at the person who tripped over the cord. You can analyze their walking patterns.
Write a thesis on why they shouldn't have been in the room.
Right. You can demand a written apology. Or you can plug the machine back in, reboot the system, and start a new game.
Which is much harder to do in practice.
So true. But it makes me wonder, does our deeply held belief that good work equals rewards actually make us more vulnerable when the cord inevitably gets unplugged?
Let's look at the organizational psychology of that exact question. The professionals who believe most fervently in a perfectly just, meritocratic workplace are actually the ones who suffer the deepest trauma when they are betrayed.
Because it's not just a job loss, it's an existential crisis.
Precisely. Their entire worldview shatters. They don't just lose their income, they lose their understanding of how the universe operates.
That is terrifying.
Conversely, the individuals who bounce back faster, the ones who exhibit high career resilience, tend to view a career as an ecosystem.
An ecosystem? How so?
Well, an ecosystem is subject to shifting weather patterns, apex predators, sudden droughts, and sheer luck. So when the corporate storm hits, they don't stand in the rain screaming, "Why is it raining on me when I've been such a good employee?"
They just accept the rain.
Right. They immediately start looking for shelter. They accept the weather.
Which transitions perfectly into the next phase of Edmund's journey in the text. Because once you finally exhaust that anger...
Once you stop screaming at the rain.
Exactly. Once you realize you are stuck in this dark place, this period of acute stagnation, the question becomes, what do you actually do with that time?
And this is where the narrative pivots from a simple tragedy into an absolute masterclass in strategic resilience. Edmund is in the Chateau d'If. He is physically deteriorating, staring at the stone walls, entirely consumed by despair.
And then something happens.
Yes. Eventually, through sheer chance, he meets another prisoner, Abbé Faria, an old priest and scholar. Faria becomes his teacher. And Edmund makes a profound, grueling pivot.
He channels the energy of his anger into rigorous education.
He does. He starts learning multiple languages: mathematics, science, history, economics, philosophy.
The source material distills this perfectly. It argues that while they can imprison your body, or in a modern sense, they can stall your career, your mind remains your own sovereign territory.
No one can take that from you.
Right. The text posits that growth during periods of comfort and success is essentially optional. You can toast. But growth during profound hardship is transformative. It is mandatory for survival.
Edmunds stops mourning the sailor he was, and he learns to think on a completely different level.
The underlying premise is that your mind is your greatest weapon, and it needs to be forged in the dark.
Let's map this prison to the modern professional landscape,
Mhm.
because the modern equivalent of the Chateau d'If is rarely a physical cell
It's usually a cubicle.
or a home office. It is being trapped in a highly toxic job under a narcissistic manager, a job you simply cannot afford to leave because of your mortgage or the current macroeconomic climate.
Or it's sitting on the sidelines, legally gagged.
Exactly. Writing out an ironclad non-compete clause where you literally aren't allowed to work in the industry you spent 10 years mastering.
Or, perhaps most commonly, it is enduring a brutal, demoralizing stretch of long-term unemployment, sending hundreds of resumes into the void and hearing absolute silence.
And if you are in that scenario, the immediate challenge is, how do you find your Ave Faria?
Right, because nobody is tunneling through your apartment wall to teach you chemistry and economics.
Exactly. In the modern context, finding your teacher requires aggressive, intentional action. It means seeking out mentors who operate entirely outside of your current industry.
Getting out of your own echo chamber.
It means reading deeply and structurally. It means aggressively upskilling when the traditional career ladder has been completely sawed off.
But the challenge is, when there is no immediate visible reward, when there's no promotion dangling in front of you, investing heavily in yourself feels deeply counterintuitive.
The vast majority of people wait for the right time to grow, which usually means waiting for a company to pay for their professional development.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this a little bit because it risks sounding a bit hollow.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you are listening to this right now and you've just been passed over for a massive promotion that went to the CEO's nephew, or you've been laid off via an automated 3.0 a.m. email.
The worst kind of layoff.
Yeah. Isn't it a bit like toxic positivity to say, hey, just read some Stoic philosophy and learn a new coding language? I mean, how do you physically force your brain to switch from a state of acute survival mode, worrying about health insurance and rent, into a state of expansive growth mode when the wound is still bleeding?
That is the essential hurdle, and we absolutely must separate this from toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is telling yourself, everything happens for a reason. I'm glad I got fired.
Which is just lying to yourself.
It is a delusion. The text is not advocating for delusion. It is not about ignoring the pain, and it certainly isn't about pretending you aren't terrified of the future.
So what is it about them?
It is entirely about the mechanics of energy redirection. Anger, resentment, and rumination are incredibly high energy states. They burn a massive amount of your brain's glucose and cognitive fuel.
Just spinning your wheels.
Right. What Edmund did and what hyper-resilient professionals do is recognize that fuel source. They take the raw combustible energy that was being burned on hating their former boss, and they route it directly into intellectual expansion.
So you aren't learning a new skill to stay positive.
No, you're learning a new skill to forge a weapon for your eventual escape. It is a calculated survival tactic. It is not a self-care retreat.
Oh, wow. That framing changes everything. It's not a spa day for your brain. It is the armory.
The armory, I like that.
You are systematically stockpiling resources in the dark for the exact moment the door finally cracks open. Think about the neuroplasticity of that.
Exactly. You're rewiring the brain.
If you are a specialized software developer who gets laid off, your instinct is to obsess over code. But if you take that time to learn behavioral psychology or supply chain logistics, completely unrelated fields, you are creating new neural pathways.
You're diversifying your cognitive portfolio.
I actually saw this play out in real life once. I knew a marketing director who was caught in a brutal, airtight non-compete after a really ugly, litigious split with his agency.
Those are the worst.
He couldn't talk to his old clients, couldn't work in the sector. He was radiating fury. But instead of draining his savings, suing them out of spite, or drinking himself into a stupor every night, He spent those 8 months learning advanced data analytics and machine learning.
Fields completely outside his traditional creative wheelhouse.
Exactly. He forced himself to do it. And when his non-compete finally expired, he didn't just go back to his old job level at a different agency. He leaped over everyone, including the people who ousted him, because he now possessed this rare hybrid skill set.
Creative marketing paired with hard data science. That's incredibly valuable.
And nobody else in his cohort had it.
That is the perfect modern manifestation of the Edmond Dantes protocol. The source document notes something critical here. Growth during profound hardship fundamentally alters your trajectory.
Because by the time he escapes, he's different.
Exactly. By the time Edmund finally escapes the prison, the text points out, he is no longer the naive sailor who was thrown in. He has been transmuted.
He emerges not as a victim defined by his capture, but as an entity with lethal purpose, expansive knowledge, and a meticulous plan. He weaponized his time in the dark.
But the narrative doesn't end with the escape. And this brings us to a fascinating psychological crossroad.
Because the growth in the dark eventually, inevitably, leads to a breakthrough. Edmund escapes.
He does. And he secures this massive hidden treasure on the island of Monte Cristo.
He becomes incredibly, unfathomably wealthy, and he reinvents himself as the Count of Monte Cristo. He has achieved the ultimate definitive bounce back.
But what actually happens when you finally escape the setback and regain your footing? You have power again. And the text dives deeply into the incredibly seductive, almost narcotic allure of revenge.
The text establishes a very clear rule. Power reveals who you truly are. It removes the constraints.
Edmund now has infinite resources at his disposal, and his entire existence becomes focused on slow, precise, systemic revenge against the specific men who betrayed him.
And what makes the story so compelling is that initially it feels entirely justified to the reader.
Because he was wronged.
Right. They stole decades of his life, they ruined his father. But the document shifts its focus to illuminate the massive, often unseen cost of this retaliation.
Because his targets don't suffer in a vacuum.
Exactly. The text highlights that as Edmund executes these brilliant, devastating traps, innocent people are caught in the crossfire, families are destroyed, children of his enemies, who had nothing to do with the original betrayal, are collateral damage.
And this forces a confrontation with a very uncomfortable truth. Justice and revenge are not the same thing, even if they wear the same clothes.
Let's map this directly to the modern corporate ascent because this happens every day. The bounce back occurs. You were pushed out of your firm, but now you've launched a highly successful rival startup that is pulling in massive funding.
Or maybe you've climbed the executive ladder at a major competitor.
And suddenly you find yourself wielding direct power over the very people or the very company that wronged you years ago. The temptation for professional revenge in that scenario is intoxicating.
Oh, it triggers massive dopamine releases in the brain just fantasizing about it.
Oh, absolutely. It's the stuff Hollywood is built on. You want your pretty woman moment.
Right, walking into the store with a shopping bag.
Exactly. You want to walk back into the boardroom with all the leverage and say, big mistake, huge. You want them to feel the exact humiliation you felt.
But in the granular reality of the professional world, indulging that impulse looks very different. It looks like deliberately blacklisting former colleagues from industry events using your influence to ensure they can't find work.
It looks like poaching a rival's top clients or key engineers at a massive premium.
And not because it actually makes strategic or financial sense for your own business. Purely to inflict pain on your old boss.
Or it looks like orchestrating hostile takeovers specifically to dismantle a legacy rather than to build value.
If I can create an analogy here.
Please do.
Seeking professional revenge is essentially like secretly pouring gasoline around your competitor's office building and striking a match. But you are so fixated on watching the flames that you don't realize the wind is blowing all the toxic smoke directly into your own headquarters.
Suffocating your own employees.
Right. At what point does the mission of proving them wrong cross the line into active self-sabotage?
That line is the exact psychological border between justice and revenge, and understanding the mechanism of each is crucial. Justice is fundamentally about restoring balance and righting a wrong.
It is bound by proportionality.
Right. Filing a lawsuit against a former employer for stolen wages or breach of contract. That is justice. It is a necessary mechanism to enforce boundaries.
Revenge, however, is not about balance. It is deeply emotional, driven by the ego's need to dominate and destroy, and by its very nature, it acts like a contagion.
When a CEO or a founder is operating out of a hidden desire for revenge, they invariably create incredibly toxic, paranoid work cultures.
Their strategic vision narrows. They become obsessed with monitoring the competition rather than fostering their own internal innovation.
And the collateral damage is entirely real. Think about a founder who is so consumed by the need to crush the company that fired them, they force their new startup team to work 100-hour weeks just to beat the old company to a product launch.
The original betrayers aren't the only ones suffering.
The new, entirely innocent employees are burning out, missing their kids' birthdays, and having their mental health ruined because of a personal vendetta they had absolutely nothing to do with.
The leader's trauma becomes the culture.
That's a chilling phrase.
The leader's unresolved trauma literally becomes the entire organization's operating system. And this dynamic introduces a much deeper internal crisis for our protagonist, and frankly, for any professional trying to navigate life post-betrayal.
The text introduces a concept we can call the danger of the cynical rebrand.
The cynical rebrand. Let's look closely at what the text tells us here.
As Edmund is executing his revenge, he experiences an identity crisis. He starts looking in the mirror and questioning, have I become the very monster I despised?
The document notes a profound shift. At the beginning of the story, Edmund was fundamentally defined by hope and optimism.
But after the betrayal, and through his quest for vengeance, he becomes entirely defined by his pain.
And this is the warning. If you leave it unchecked, pain will completely reshape your identity. It will rewire your personality.
It turns a naturally kind, collaborative person into someone cold and calculated.
It turns a hopeful visionary into a paranoid cynic. The true danger of a career setback isn't the suffering you endured in the moment.
The existential danger is surviving the setback, only to realize you have mutated into someone you no longer recognize or respect.
This is perhaps the most insidious, creeping aspect of professional setbacks. The trauma literally hardens our neural pathways.
If we translate this to the modern workplace, think about the mid-level manager who was once incredibly trusting and supportive, but got completely thrown under the bus by a lazy, manipulative subordinate who stole their work to get a promotion.
In response to that acute pain, the manager adopts a cynical rebrand. They make a vow. I will never be made a fool of again.
And so their entire management style mutates. They begin to aggressively micromanage their new, entirely innocent team.
They install keystroke tracking software. They demand to be CC'd on every single piece of external communication.
They assume every request for time off is a lie.
Or take the startup founder who brought in a co-founder early on, trusted them implicitly, and got cheated out of massive equity on a technicality.
And now, in their next venture, they flat out refuse to trust anyone. They hoard all the decision-making power.
They refuse to delegate even minor tasks. They won't bring in a seasoned COO because they are terrified of losing control.
And as a direct result, they bottleneck their own company's growth. The company stalls at $5 million in revenue because one person can only do so much.
They tell themselves they are being smart and protecting the business, but they are actually strangling their own potential.
The neuroscience of how the brain justifies this is fascinating. The brain's amygdala, which handles threat detection, has been hypersensitized by the past betrayal.
So the brain rationalizes the paranoia. Says, I am not damaged. I am just finally seeing the world clearly. I am learning from my mistakes.
But we have to clearly define the massive difference between integrating a professional lesson and allowing a past trauma to dictate your operational baseline.
The desire to protect yourself slowly and quietly mutates into rigid cynicism. And cynicism is a fundamentally disastrous business strategy over the long term.
Why? Because innovation requires psychological safety.
Exactly. Creativity requires the willingness to pitch a terrible idea without fear of ridicule. Collaboration requires a baseline of trust.
When a leader is cynical, their hypervigilance signals to the entire team's nervous systems that the environment is unsafe. The team literally stops producing novel ideas because their energy is entirely focused on compliance and avoiding the leader's suspicion.
I want to really dig into this distinction because it's a tightrope walk. Where exactly is the line drawn?
Yeah, where's the boundary between learning a very tough, necessary lesson like, okay, I am absolutely never signing a partnership agreement without my own independent counsel ever again, and letting the pain completely define your professional identity?
How do we stay savvy? How do we protect our necks in an undeniably competitive world without turning into stone?
It comes down to architecture. Are you building smarter doors or are you building impenetrable walls?
A boundary like requiring independent legal review or implementing a clear QA process for subordinate work is a smart door.
It is a structural process that protects you automatically without requiring continuous emotional energy. It allows you to trust the process so you don't have to constantly scrutinize the person.
Cynicism, on the other hand, is a wall. It is an emotional posture. It is the default assumption that everyone you meet is a latent threat.
If your baseline assumption is that every new hire is lazy or every new vendor is trying to scam you, you have crossed the line from savvy to cynical.
You are no longer defined by your vision for what you can build. You are defined entirely by your fear of what could be taken from you.
Defined entirely by your fear of what could be taken from you. That hits incredibly hard because it's a prison of your own making.
And if cynicism is the trap, how do we dismantle it? Because let's be honest, cynicism feels very safe. It feels like the natural default setting after a major betrayal.
According to the text, escaping this cynical loop requires a highly specific intentional action. And it's an action that is incredibly difficult to execute, especially in highly competitive, zero-sum corporate environments.
It requires an immense amount of cognitive override. This brings us to the concept of the ROI of mercy and letting go.
The narrative anchor in Dumas' story is that Edmund eventually reaches a profound turning point. He sees the widening circle of collateral damage. He sees the terror in the eyes of innocent people.
He looks at what he is becoming, and he realizes that continuing down the path of absolute revenge will only manufacture an endless cycle of suffering, ultimately consuming him.
So he makes an active choice to stop. The text explicitly notes that this choice wasn't forced upon him by external circumstances. He had the power to keep going.
And it wasn't an easy moral epiphany. It was a grueling, intentional decision. He chooses to show mercy, and in doing so, he reclaims his own humanity from the trauma.
The document states, "True strength is knowing when to let go." That is the absolute core of the lesson.
It points out that holding on to anger is actually the path of least resistance. Anger feels powerful. It gives you a sense of momentum.
But letting go requires hyper-awareness, deep humility, and courage. And importantly, it notes that in a competitive society, letting go is almost universally misunderstood as weakness or submission.
Especially in the realm of business. In corporate culture, mercy is often viewed as a liability. But let's look at the highly practical, modern applications of this concept.
Letting go might look like choosing to drop a draining, multi-year intellectual property lawsuit against a former employer, even if you know factually and legally that you are right.
You drop it because the litigation is consuming 40% of your working hours and making you miserable.
It might look like politely declining the opportunity to speak ill of a former toxic boss during a high-profile industry interview, choosing instead to focus entirely on your new ventures.
Or from a leadership perspective, it could mean forgiving a loyal team member's massive, expensive mistake, using it as a teaching moment instead of firing them publicly to flex your authority.
Okay, I have to jump in and push back here because this is where the theory hits the pavement. I get the moral high ground of letting it go. But in a cutthroat, highly aggressive corporate culture, if a competitor plays dirty, orchestrates a smear campaign, steals your top client, and you just smile and say, "I'm letting it go to protect my peace," aren't you essentially hanging a neon free money sign around your neck?
That is the classic, entirely valid fear. But it conflates the concept of mercy with an absence of boundaries, and this distinction is paramount.
Letting go does not mean you allow them to steal the next client. You still fortify your contracts. You still compete fiercely in the marketplace.
You still innovate to make their product obsolete.
Yeah.
What you are letting go of is the internal emotional baggage and the obsessive desire for personal retaliation.
If we look at this purely through the lens of organizational efficiency, there is a massive return on investment and actual quantifiable ROI to letting go.
The ROI of mercy. I really like how you framed that. Let's break that down. What is the actual measurable return?
It is the reclamation of cognitive bandwidth. Cognitive bandwidth is the single most precious finite resource any professional possesses.
Think of your brain like a computer's RAM. Every ounce of mental energy you spend plotting to ruin a rival or obsessing over how unfairly you were treated in 2021 is a background program running constantly.
If 30% of your RAM is dedicated to resentment, you only have 70% of your processing power left to solve actual supply chain issues.
Or to mentor your team, or to recognize shifting market trends.
By intentionally stopping a cycle of professional retaliation, you are executing the ultimate strategic power move. You are forcing a system-wide task manager quit on those background programs.
You definitively prove to your own nervous system that the past and the people who wronged you no longer dictate your actions or monopolize your attention. You take your brain back.
You take your brain back. Because when you are constantly fighting the old war, you are physically incapable of seeing the new opportunities.
If you're running a marathon and you are constantly looking over your shoulder to glare at the runner behind you, you are inevitably going to trip over the hurdle directly in front of you.
Precisely. And shedding that heavy, toxic baggage is the exact mechanism that allows you to engage in the final, most crucial phase of this entire journey.
We've walked through the anatomy of the sudden fall. We've explored how to use the dark prison of stagnation to forge new cognitive weapons.
We've navigated the incredibly toxic dopamine lure of revenge, and we've discussed the strategic, bandwidth-saving power of letting go.
But the source document provides one final vital reality check. And it is about the timeline of this entire process, because this is not a weekend executive retreat.
No, it absolutely is not. Which brings us to the concept of the marathon of recovery in time, because Edmund's transformation from a naive sailor in a dungeon to the incredibly educated, powerful Count of Monte Cristo, and finally to a man who finds peace, didn't happen in a snabby 3-minute movie montage with an upbeat pop song in the background.
It took decades of grueling existence.
The document highlights this profound, unhackable truth. Time is the ultimate unavoidable teacher.
The text is exceptionally pointed in its critique of our modern impulses here. It states, we want fast results, fast success, fast healing.
But real structural change takes an immense amount of time to learn, to reflect, and to deeply understand.
It argues a beautiful paradox. The time that felt like a cruel punishment, those long years in the physical prison for Edmund, or for us, those years wandering in the career wilderness, taking sideways jobs to pay the bills, eventually becomes the exact forge that shapes your ultimate capacity.
You cannot rush the forge.
And Edmund leaves behind this final iconic message at the end of the story: wait and hope. But the document is very careful to clarify the definition of those words.
He does not mean waiting blindly. He does not mean waiting passively for the universe to hand you an apology.
He means waiting with active patience and maintaining the core belief that life can still synthesize meaning out of profound suffering.
Let's apply this directly to the modern landscape, because this philosophy is the ultimate antidote to the toxic hustle culture we currently live in.
We are entirely conditioned by social media to expect the overnight, frictionless comeback. If a prominent CEO is ousted in a scandal, the business media expect them to launch a new billion-dollar unicorn startup 6 months later, fully healed and ready to dominate.
But surviving a massive structural industry shift, like, say, your entire profession being displaced by generative AI, or rebuilding a shattered reputation after a highly public business bankruptcy, that might take 10 years. Not 10 weeks.
The expectation of speed is what breaks people.
We treat career recovery like a microwave dinner. We get laid off or we get betrayed, and our immediate thought is, okay, I just need to punch in some aggressive networking, rebrand my LinkedIn profile with some new synergy buzzwords, attend 3 industry conferences, and ding, I'm healed in 60 seconds.
We expect to be fully actualized, financially secure, and back on top of the hierarchy instantly.
But the text is warning us that psychological and professional transformation is a slow roast. If you take a frozen piece of meat and blast it in the microwave on high, what happens?
The water molecules vibrate violently, tearing the cellular structure apart.
You end up with something that is scalding hot and burned on the outside, but completely frozen and raw in the center. If you try to microwave a 10-year career transformation, you're just going to end up burned out on the outside and completely frozen in your trauma on the inside.
That is a phenomenal, biologically accurate analogy. Burned on the outside and frozen on the inside is the exact profile of the cynical, hollow professional we discussed earlier.
They performed the external actions of recovery, the networking, the new job title, without allowing the friction of time to facilitate actual psychological synthesis.
This brings up the crucial concept of active waiting. When Edmund says wait and hope, he isn't saying sit on your couch, stare at the ceiling, and wait for a recruiter to call you.
Right, because he spent his waiting time aggressively learning astrophysics and multiple languages.
Exactly. Active patience means you are doing the daily, unglamorous, often tedious work. You are reaching out to contacts. You are studying the shifting market. You are refining your hard skills. You are managing your budget.
And this is the key, you are completely detaching your ego from the anxiety of an immediate timeline. You accept that you might not see the harvest for 5 years.
You're enduring the friction of time. And enduring that friction is absolutely biologically necessary for deep professional mastery and genuine, unshakable resilience.
You simply cannot hack wisdom. It has to be metabolized through the passage of time.
You cannot hack wisdom. That perfectly encapsulates Edmund's time in the dark.
So let's pull all of these massive, complex threads together, because we have taken a profound journey today extracting the architecture of a 19th century masterpiece and mapping it flawlessly onto the modern cubicle, the hostile boardroom, and the isolated home office.
If we synthesize this entire arc, we aren't just looking at a story, we're looking at a complete, actionable blueprint for professional rebirth.
It begins with the harsh acknowledgement of the absolute fragility of our control, understanding that a sudden, catastrophic professional freefall can happen to anyone entirely regardless of their merit or morality.
It then moves into the absolute necessity of using your prison time, the forced unemployment, the humiliating demotion, the non-compete phase, to aggressively and intentionally sharpen your mind, rerouting the high-octane fuel of resentment into intellectual expansion.
It explicitly warns us to navigate the incredibly toxic, addictive lure of revenge and to avoid the danger of the cynical rebrand once we do finally regain power and leverage.
And finally, it asks us to make the grueling choice to embrace the immense bandwidth-saving strategic strength of mercy and to practice the active patience required for a timeline of recovery that we simply cannot artificially speed up.
It fundamentally reframes how we view the worst, most agonizing moments of our professional lives. It tells us that the exact moment the floor falls out from under you, it isn't the tragic end of your story.
It is the precise moment the illusion ends and the real transformative work actually begins.
The setback is the crucible. Without the betrayal, without the dungeon, Edmond Dantes remains a competent but ultimately naive sailor.
The injustice he suffered was horrific, and we shouldn't romanticize it. But his disciplined, intellectual, and ultimately merciful response to that injustice is what transmuted him into something legendary.
Which brings us to the final, lingering reflection from the source material. We've spent this time talking about mechanisms, what to do, how to act, how the brain processes trauma, and how to strategically rebuild.
But the document leaves us with a profound, deeply uncomfortable question that requires you to look entirely inward.
And I want to pose this directly to you, the listener, right now. It's a hypothetical scenario designed to strip away all the external noise.
Think about your current career. Think about your exact job title, your salary, your status within your company, your curated network of contacts.
If every single piece of that professional architecture was taken from you tomorrow without warning, without explanation, and without severance, who would you be?
Would you shatter under the weight of the injustice, or would you use the dark to grow?
Because when the title, the salary, and the status are finally stripped away, your answer to that specific question is the only thing you actually own.